Welcome to the Irish Revolution. I suppose it's very important to point out the association with the word Soviet would have been more with the concept of a workers' council or strike that took responsibility for some civil administration, not necessarily the radical communism of the nascent Soviet Union, although there were a few Bolsheviks in Ireland at the time and I'll speak about them later. But all the same, it is a curious and often overlooked part of the Irish Revolutionary period, which I'm going to explore at length today. So, the War of Independence, a social revolution. In many ways, the revolutionary generation were remarkable for their inherent conservatism. Éireann de Valera, president of the Revolutionary Republic, or the Dáil at least, was once asked what he would have been had he not been a revolutionary, and he answered that he would have been a bishop. The Irish Free State, born amidst fratricidal violence, would be the very epitome of a counter-revolution, representing foremost the interests of the professional classes in Irish business. Ernest Blythe famously cut the old age pension in 1924 from 10 shillings to 9. That is not to say that there were not socialists and revolutionaries involved, but they were very much on the margins of the political and military elite of the Sinn Fein party and the IRA. And just to make it absolutely clear, we are just a few years after the communist revolution in Russia. So, and revolutions all across Europe, left-wing revolutions, so there was something in the air at this time, okay? At the ground level, in the west of Ireland, there was a brewing social movement amongst poor farmers and labourers. Britain had introduced a number of land reforms in the late 19th and early 20th century that saw much of the agricultural land in Ireland get transferred to small and medium farmers and away from the large holdings of the old landlord class. All the same, and particularly in the poor western province of Connacht, there was still a great deal of land hunger, and the breakdown of law and order in the War of Independence led to a huge increase of rural incidents, or as they were called at the time, outrages. In fact, you'd need to go as far back as 1882, during the so-called Land War, to find a year where more outrages were committed. These outrages would have included cattle drives, stealing other farmers' cows, which attracted crowds of hundreds and were a great event in the countryside for the lads, you know. Threatening letters were sent, gates removed, walls and fences destroyed, fields vandalised, actual assault and a lot of boycotting, all kinds of carry on. It's important to note that for many middling and prosperous farmers, the First World War was a godsend. They had a ready market in Britain for their product at generous prices. This would have been resented by poorer farmers or landless labourers who, as ever, were struggling. There was also a wet spring in 1920 which served to make things even worse. Again, the breakdown of normal law and order made this agitation possible, as did the widely held belief in the West that the Sinn Féin party were in favour of rural agitation of this kind. They were not, save a few outliers of course. The historian Tony Varley suggests that the disruption of emigration during the First World War also contributed to the troubles in the countryside. Indeed, emigration was so often the type of safety valve for British rule on Ireland as wealthier farmers consolidated their lands and the more, quote, troublesome, unquote, element left the country. Sinn Féin ultimately put down the agitation, seeing the challenge to public order represented by the widespread rural agitation as a kind of threat to their own legitimacy. Of course, one could argue that the social composition of Sinn Féin more closely mirrored the quietly prosperous farmer who benefited from the land reform legislation of recent decades than the poor landless Western labourer. In putting down the unrest, Sinn Féin benefited from the support of the Catholic Church, which was adamantly opposed to the unrest. Now, moving on to the Labour Party briefly. The Labour Party abstained from the 1918 election, preferring to give the electorate a clean choice on the national question, making the 1918 election effectively a referendum on whether the people wanted to continue with the constitutional nationalism of the Irish Parliamentary Party or to go in a different direction with the more militant Sinn Féin Party. Made an episode about that, you'll see a link there now. The historian Donal O'Driscoll put it well when he wrote, quote, "The extraordinary gains made, especially from 1918, were not going to be risked by stepping boldly into the firing line. In effect, this meant becoming a support player in a middle-class revolution," unquote. That said, the Democratic Programme. Now, just as I just said, the Labour Party did not, of course, contest the 1918 election, but they still played a part in the first Dáil, the first meeting of the Revolutionary Parliament, and the clearest manifestation of this was the Democratic Programme, which was a document outlining a manifesto for social policy in an independent Ireland. It probably best epitomises the alliance of organised labour and the Republican movement at this time. It was read out during the first Dáil of January 21st, 1919. I did an episode that covers this too, which I'll link to now. The programme had been drawn up by Sean T. O'Kelly of Sinn Fein from a draft by Labour Party leader Tom Johnson. Among other things, the document called for the subordination of property rights in the interests of the public good, and every citizen had a right to, quote, an adequate share of the produce of the nation's labour, unquote. It called for an industrial policy and expansion of public services, among other lefty things. However, it is instructive to look at the original draft, which was much more left-wing. Johnson's draft originally called for, quote, the Republic will aim at the elimination of the class in society which lives upon the wealth produced by the workers of the nation, but gives no useful social service in return, and in the process of accomplishment will bring freedom to all who have hitherto been caught in the toils of economic servitude, unquote. This was, as the Marxist historian Desmond Greaves points out, a loose paraphrasing of the Communist Manifesto. Of course, it was too radical for the middle-class Sinn Féin party and was promptly deleted. Another section arguing for syndicalist, i.e. trade union workers' power, was also deleted, apparently at the demand of Michael Collins and the Irish Republican Brotherhood, IRB, who threatened to remove the programme from the Dáil meeting altogether unless he did so. Piers Beasley, looking back at 1926, regarded it as a communistic document. Beasley had been responsible for much of the pageantry of the first Dáil, which of course included the democratic programme. Beasley, who like much of the revolutionary generation turned out to be extremely conservative, clearly intended that as an insult. Okay, let's look at left-wing politics in Ireland more generally. So, there were two major left-wing socialist forces in Ireland during the War of Independence. The Labour Party, founded in 1912 by James Connolly and a few others, and the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, ITGW for short, founded by James Larkin in 1909. Much of the passion and energy of left-wing politics have been focused on the psychodrama that was the Dublin lockout in 1913, a huge industrial dispute between 20,000 workers and 300 employers, much of which could be attributed to William Martin Murphy, then the boss of the Irish Independent newspaper among many other enterprises, refusing to recognise or deal with the ITGW, or James Larkin, who he saw as a dangerous socialist radical. It was a defeat in the end for the ITGW, since most workers returned to the workplace and signed pledges not to join the union, but by 1919 the union had revived and had more members than it had in 1913. Now, it had around 100,000 members in 1919, this up from only 5,000 in 1916 and 120,000 by 1920. The Irish Trades Union Congress had around 250,000 members. More than just the numbers, trade unionism had spread across the country, whereas before it was mostly in large urban areas. What's more, the unions were distinctly more national focused, whereas before many people belonged to British-based unions, now they tended to belong to Irish unions, which of course were allied to the Republican movement on the island. Limerick was not the only place to have a Soviet, just the most famous. These workers' councils spread across the country. There were hundreds of strikes and workplace occupations in Ireland at this time, albeit the vast majority were quite temporary. Labour's alliance with Sinn Féin and the Republican movement, and I refer by the way to organised labour here, not necessarily the Labour Party, originated of course with James Connolly in the 1916 Rising, though its roots go back further. By the way, my second ever episode was about Padraig Pearse and James Connolly, so please check that out if you have the time. Some left-wing historians have tended to criticise the caution of the Labour movement, O'Driscoll again having written, quote, the Labour leadership repeatedly failed to coordinate countrywide action at crucial moments and substituted radical rhetoric for radical action. De Valera never actually said that Labour must wait, but wait it did, only to find that its moment had passed, unquote. The Labour movement was dominated by two moderate figures, Tom Johnson and William O'Brien. There were more radical trade unionists, such as Peadar O'Donnell, who was probably the closest Ireland had to a true Bolshevik radical at this time. Labour famously abstained from the 1918 election, preferring the Irish electorate to have a clean choice. Many socialists at the time considered this to be a grave mistake. On the face of it, the relationship between the left and the Sinn Féin party was a little touchy. Arthur Griffith, the leader of the pre-1916 Sinn Féin party, was opposed to the workers in the 1913 lockout and was widely loathed in left-wing circles, seen as a capitalist stooge by some. But in the post-1916 Sinn Féin party, which was, to be fair, a radically different party, there were many who were sympathetic to the Labour movement. But the nationalist consensus at the time was essentially anti-socialist. The evidence for this was clear. In 1920, the Sinn Féin party, along with the IRA, stifled the land agitation in the poor west of Ireland by landless labourers, which had threatened to upend the economic status quo there, as we talked about at the beginning of the episode. Peadar O'Donnell spent much of 1918 and 1919 wandering around Ulster, attempting to organise workers in spite of the huge sectarian problems there. Check out my episode on Ulster in the Irish Revolution. Unionists there, by which I mean those who supported the political union with Britain, not Labour activists, were equally terrified of communism as they were by Irish republicanism. The Belfast General Strike in January 1919 had terrified the political establishment. Lord French, the most senior British official in Ireland, regarded radical Labour, which united Protestant and Catholic alike, as a greater threat than Sinn Féin. In late January, early February 1919, Peadar O'Donnell led the workers of Monaghan Asylum in a strike, and they formed the first Soviet of the period. Under siege by the police, the workers raised the red flag, the workers won. From February to April, O'Donnell led another strike among mill workers in the Protestant town of Collin, County Tyrone. Every night there was a red flag procession. One side had written the loyalist slogan, "No surrender," and the other side, "Up the Irish transport." Less fortunate for O'Donnell, this strike was not as successful. But just as an aside, I wish there'd be more attempts like this to unite working people of both religions, and in this ultimately doomed struggle, we can at least take heart that for a brief time in 1919, in a divided town in County Tyrone, a noble attempt was made. There was a huge and successful general strike in 1920, and the ITGW organised rail workers to prevent them carrying British troops or personnel on trains. And this did help make British administration in Ireland even more difficult. But that is not the focus of today's video, that will be the focus of another video in the future. The People's Republic of Ireland. Perhaps the most famous of the so-called Soviets was the Limerick Soviet, which lasted for 10 days in April 1919. Just to remind you, a Soviet was a workers' council that took control of local administration and would not have had the same connotation as perhaps it would have had a few years later. The Limerick Trades Council effectively took control of the city after a local trade unionist and IRA man was killed during a rescue attempt. The subsequent military reaction to this and the restrictions on movement were widely resented, which led to the strike. The Soviet issued its own currency and organised supplies for the city. 14,000 workers downed tools. Interestingly, the price of a pint of milk dropped from 7 pence to 3 pence, perhaps an indication of the power of the middleman or gambeen in the Irish economy. If anyone knows anything about that, please mention it in the comments. I'd be curious to learn more actually. There happened to be a large number of international journalists in Limerick at the time, there to cover a mooted transatlantic flight, and as a result the Soviet got a huge amount of international coverage. But could it be considered a socialist revolt? Not according to the historian Liam Cahill, who wrote, quote, "In the end, the Soviet was basically an emotional and spontaneous protest on essentially nationalist and humanitarian grounds, rather than anything based on socialist or even trade union aims," unquote. Here are some of the other strikes and Soviets. In October 1919, workers took control of Monaghan town for 5 days and won themselves a pay increase. I've always said, Monaghan, been communist for a very long time. Peadar O'Donnell, closely involved in Monaghan-based agitation, wrote, quote, "The proletariat have fought shoulder to shoulder under their own flag. The capitalist game of divide and conquer met with a serious reverse when all the town workers abandoned their fancy colours and united under the red," unquote. In July 1919, 150 farm labourers in Churchtown and Bootyvant, County Cork, struck for a wage increase and were joined in a sympathy strike by local creamery workers. Workers marched under a red banner which declared, quote, "Workers of the world unite! The unorganised worker is a slave of the employer," unquote. After 2 weeks, the workers were victorious. Now this led to a pattern of creameries being occupied in Derry-rich Munster, the most famous of which was the occupation at Knocklong, County Limerick in May 1920. The red flag flew alongside the Republican tricolour and the famous slogan, "We make butter, not profits," was draped in front of the building. Some of the leaders of the Knocklong Soviet were in fact self-described communists, but this was far from the norm in the country. In April 1920, there was a 24-hour general strike, during which many towns across Ireland were briefly occupied by trades councils, which led to the release of Republican hunger strikers in Mountjoy Jail in Dublin. In April 1920, railway workers and the National Union of Railwaymen boycotted the British military, which led to the closure of many rail lines and seriously hampered British administration. In late 1920, the ITGWU supported the Sinn Féin-led Belfast boycott in retaliation against sectarian attacks against Catholic workers in Belfast and other northern towns. Between May and June 1921, the Éireann Soviet took control of the coal mines on the Leitrim-Roscommon border and successfully ran the mine for 2 months. It would be remiss of me not to mention, as the Marxist historian Conor Costick did in a recent article that I'll link to in the description, that there were no women involved in the Limerick Soviet, for example, and that all of the Soviets tended to be all-male affairs. That said, the Irish Revolution was remarkable for the participation of women at the time in Cumann na mBan, for example, a sort of auxiliary organisation of the IRA. And just remember, at this time, women still didn't have the vote in a lot of countries. There was even a government minister or secretary for Labour, Constance Markovich, who was of course a woman. It's a fair critique, but the lack of participation of women in the Labour movement was merely a reflection of the times, unfortunately. I'll not get into what happened during the truce and post-treaty period, as that would overly complicate today's episode. But do not let it be said that the War of Independence was fought only by the IRA and the Sinn Féin party. The Irish Labour movement deserves its due. Alright, thanks so much for watching. This was a longer one than usual, so thanks for hanging in there. Please let everyone you know about the channel, helping us grow. And that's it. I'll talk to you soon. Good luck now. Good luck.